So we did an exercise this year for Lent. For the beginning of Lent, we took things that represent our life and we put them in this bowl. So we want to share with you what's in this morning. There's a mask.
Hospital pager.
Prayer candle.
Bike light.
Because we wish we could be biking. Duct tape, because you can use it to fix anything except a leaking oil boiler. We found that out this week.
We got pictures of our kids, a Bible,
a leash to walk our dog Toby, who we talk about all the time. Oh, another mask. Huh. I don't know about you, but all our pockets at our house have masks and dog bags.
Got our Lenten devotional cards that you all should have.
Right.
Oh, bills.
Bills. Yeah, bills. Copy of the New Yorker, which I buy mostly for the cover art. I don't usually get around to reading it, but
cartoons inside.
They're beautiful every week. Oh, my calendar, which is the reason why I don't get to the New Yorker every week. Oh, and yet another mask. Another mask.
It's a lot of stuff.
It is. And the cool thing about this bowl, the reason we use this bowl is this is a Tibetan singing bowl that I bought a number of years ago because it has this wonderful, rich sound when you strike it.
Clear, ethereal, gorgeous.
But not when it's filled with stuff. Bowls only ring when they're empty, right?
You might have heard that it's Lent. It began last Ash Wednesday, and it's the Christian liturgical season of getting empty. These 40 days mirror Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness, when he was, in Matthew's gospel, led out into the wilderness by the Spirit. Right after he was baptized and he heard those crucial words that I hope you heard in the prayer this morning, that he was beloved. And he wanted his whole life to ring with that beauty, with that assurance, that clarity of God's love. And to really do that, he needed to be emptied. And so he went out into the wilderness. Empty of food, yes, during the fast, but also empty of every other thing that could clutter his spirit, so that when temptations did come his way, to take the easy route to power and worldly glory, we remember the words of the tempter, "If you are the Son of God." He could see clearly enough to know where his true allegiance lay. Not with human power, but with God. And God's never-ending, patient, powerful love that assured him of his belovedness.
The season of Lent is one of the earliest things that the Christian church has marked as part of the year, because centuries ago, people understood what we know now. I mean, we have good intentions with our spiritual lives.
Almost always.
And then life happens, and our lives fill up with all kinds of things like this bowl. They fill up with responsibilities and joys and sorrows and desires and frustrations until before we know it, we've lost track of anything that looks like God or what God calls us to be in the world. And so this is a season that's been marked for centuries as a time to empty ourselves out so that we can see more clearly who we are and how we live, how we love, and make some adjustments to our living. It gives us a time to repent, to turn ourselves toward God again, so that we can see clearly and we can ring clearly.
Traditionally, the church has offered 3 practices for Lent, drawing from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount that we read on Ash Wednesday in Matthew 6. Fasting, prayer, and almsgiving as ways to empty our spirits. Let's start with fasting, because it's the one that is the least fashionable, I guess.
It's also the most commonly associated with Lent, right?
This is true.
When people say, what are you going to give up for Lent, right? I've every year volunteered to give up the annual statistical reports for Lent, right? And the conference has never taken me up on it.
The Methodist Church has never been big on that fast.
I think they scheduled a deadline to be during the season of Epiphany so that I can't do that. I don't know about you, but I've given up all kinds of things over the years. Different things, different years, different success. And I will confess that sometimes, especially in my younger years, I would give things up just to see if I could give them up for 40 days. There was the year we both gave up coffee for Lent, right?
That was the grumpiest Lent.
It was a grumpy Lent.
It was easier to give up beer for 40 days than to give up coffee for 40 days.
Definitely true. Which was missing the point, right? Giving something up for Lent isn't about figuring out how strong my willpower is. Lent isn't an extra New Year's resolutions in the middle of the year. Fasting is about giving up something that's taking too much of my time or energy, something that's just become mindless in my own life, so that I can become more mindful of the rest of my day and more mindful of God in the rest of my day. I think of it sometimes as spring cleaning, removing the clutter so that I can see what's really there.
At last week's Ash Wednesday service, and she alluded to it a little bit during the children's time too, Caitlin gave us an example of how she is fasting during Lent. If you don't mind our...
No, she gave us permission.
Oh, she gave us permission. Okay, good. She became conscious of how much of her time is spent on scrolling through social media, being a 20-something kind of person.
Oh, like it only
like
happens
no
to
only
20
happens
somethings.
there. Yeah, okay. But she recognized how often she would look at her phone whenever there was a spare moment. You open the phone. Or if there's an awkward moment, you look at your phone. But how ironically, being on social media was making her less social with actual flesh and blood people in her life. I'm seeing lots of nods out there. In fact, there's been a series of articles in the New York Times about how teens are discovering that to be the case, and many of them they're calling themselves, I love it, Luddites, and are actually bailing on phones because they're finding that these social media is keeping them from actually being social. When the more social media, the more lonely you feel, the more alone you feel. So she's fasting from social media this Lent.
And this is what struck us as brilliant in her description on Wednesday. And again, Caitlin's touched on this a little bit today. She didn't just disable all the media sites on her phone, though she did do that because it's easier to not scroll if they're not there, right? She also considered what to do whenever she reflexively goes to look at her phone, and decided that she would pray for the folks who she would be following their feeds of on social media, or even more radical, she would talk to the people who are around her. Imagine talking to the people that are around you instead of everybody standing next to each other looking at their phones. It would revolutionize the world.
That's so radical. Now, I don't live on social media quite as much as I used to.
That's true.
But I do have a bad habit late at night, and I found out there's a name for it. It's called doom scrolling, where for some reason about 11 o'clock I turn on my phone and I look at the news feed from the New York Times and the Guardian to check out what fresh horror is being unleashed on the world at 11:30 at night, right before I go to bed.
I go to bed before he starts doom scrolling.
And let's not say it's the most emotionally healthy way to end the day. So I'm deciding I'm definitely going to be replacing my doom scrolling with prayer. That will be my fast this year, is praying for the state of the world rather than reading about it right before I go to bed. I think it must be I think I might have some control over what happens when I go to sleep if I read about it right before. But my phone has a stress. It can tell how stressful I am. And in the morning, I check how my sleep was. Is that sad? We check how, let me find out how I slept. But right before I go to bed, it spikes up, surprise, and it takes an hour. Even after I fall asleep, it takes an hour for my stress level to go back down after I've been doom scrolling. So this will be...
You might want to give it up.
I think I'm going to give that up. I can go 40 days.
I could go 40
without
days.
knowing what Putin is up to. Yeah, it'll be fine.
Which brings us to the second practice, which is prayer, right? There are so many ways to pray during Lent. We're not even going to get into anything like a complete list of it, but we want to just offer some hints. So we mentioned the prayer cards that we had in our bowl. Those are out in the vestry for you to pick up. They started last Ash Wednesday, but you can jump in anytime and use those as a way to spark your own prayer practice this Lent. You can also work prayer into whatever space is left when you've given something up for fasting, taking the time that you would have spent doing something else to pray.
On Ash Wednesday, I talked about how with just, for me, a very simple shift of awareness and change of focus, my dog walk can become a God walk.
Which you can do with everything, with brushing your teeth or washing the dishes.
I can lose my place brushing my teeth if I'm praying.
Washing clothes, folding clothes, whatever you're making your coffee or your tea in the morning, those are times to be with God in prayer. They could be times that you pray for the world, maybe, or pray for people you know who are in need, or pray for yourself even. I like to think of them just as times that we just hang out with God. I sometimes think that God wishes we would do more just hanging out. Not asking for things, not bringing petitions. I don't think God minds getting those. But I think God likes us just to be. And so Lent is a great time to practice for 40 days, just making coffee with God in the morning.
I used to think of a Lenten prayer time as a date with God, and also learned to be a little bit more quiet, because I was imagining what it must be like to be on a date when your date's going, hey, I have this list of things I really need you to take care of right now. Could you? I'm really concerned about my uncle who's sick and the state of the world and so I've learned how to be a little quieter and just listen during my date times with God. And there's a third Lenten discipline, and it's a lovely old-fashioned word, almsgiving, which is a word for giving money and time to those in need. Now, there's all sorts of ways that we can do this during Lent. There are any number of amazing and wonderful organizations that benefit from our financial generosity, whether it's earthquake relief in Turkey or aid to Ukraine or helping with the homeless and the poor, you name it. But there's also ways we can operate more personally as well. And those are always before you. We have a colleague of ours that makes it a point during Lent to always give money to whoever asks for it, without thinking of, is this going to be spent properly? Does this person deserve it? During Lent, every day they will do that. Other folk have a wonderful discipline of putting money aside each day of Lent, especially if they're fasting for a meal. They take that money, or if they're giving up chocolate, they take that money that goes to those fancy bars that you were buying. Set each day, set that aside to give as your Easter offering 40 days from now.
And almsgiving isn't just giving money, right? It's giving of ourselves as well, giving of our time or giving of our attention. So I know a family with kids, and they challenge each other to be extra kind to someone every day of Lent. And then at dinner, they share what that kindness was during their day. Or a colleague of mine writes a letter every day at Lent to someone that he knows needs some support, right? He writes a physical letter and mails it in the mail. We can volunteer our time and presence in all kinds of ways, in food pantries, in our feeding ministries here, reading to kids at the library, helping a neighbor with childcare or with chores. It's all almsgiving. All of it is emptying a portion of ourselves and inviting God in, and in the process, seeing more clearly what the world is around us and what God's calling is.
Now, did you notice that the ancient Christian Lenten practices, it's really easy to turn them into a bunch of rules to follow for 40 days, but it's not about rules. These Lenten practices are about emptying ourselves in order to be about relationship, about entering into deeper and more real relationships with other people instead of doom scrolling, meeting the needs of real people around us, hanging out with God in prayer and hanging out with God through and in other people. The temptations that Jesus faced in the wilderness were all about making himself the center. Turning stones into bread will indeed feed the hungry, but it was about his own power of magical transformation. Throwing himself from the temple just to prove that the angels will catch him, well, that doesn't even need explaining. And worshiping the tempter so that all the world can belong to Jesus. Again, the temptation was about him becoming the center.
And each time Jesus responds by putting the focus onto God. I'm fed by God's word alone. I'm not going to put God to the test. I'm going to worship and serve God. That is my primary relationship. Jesus took it from himself to the relationship that he had with all that is holy. That was where his center was.
His center was the title he was called at his baptism, Beloved. That was his grounding against the temptations of the tempter. And it's also, we believe, what we're here for. Our grounding is our being beloved of God and our calling to love God back, to love our neighbor, to love ourselves, to love creation. Lent is about seeing clearly what belovedness is. It's reorienting our lives around it. It's so central to who we are. And it can get so cluttered up with all the distractions and demands of 21st century life. Even God, the source of our belovedness, the source of all we are, can get crowded out amidst all the junk.
So whether the issue for you is that you get crushed by the busyness of life, or whether it's that you get crushed by the boredom and maybe the loneliness of life. When you find yourself, as Mary Oliver said, so far from the hope of myself, Lent offers a corrective to that, a path back to holiness, to faithfulness, to clarity, to the right kind of relationship with God and ourselves and each other. And so we invite you these next 40 days to empty yourself and make space to be with God and look for God and listen for God in that emptiness. And listen to see if you can hear your life sing. May this be our life.